Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club's spiritual edition. Oops, sorry. Uh, Today we're going to be continuing our reading of Flow by Mihaly Mr. C. I call him Mr. C, so I don't know how to pronounce that name. Anyways, this book was inspired by an animated film with the same name, Flow. I don't think there's any association or connection to it, but I thought it would be interesting to read the book since I've heard about it for quite a while. The book, I mean. So I thought I'd read it with you guys. And today we're going to be reading chapter 4, and this is part 2. So here we go. And there might be areas where there's like a highlighted yellow highlighter with certain words or phrases. That means there's a footnote in the back, and we will be reading that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit. If you have a book, you can follow us with us there. If you don't, you could follow with us on the camera here on Zoom, whatever works for you. Okay. All right. The autotelic personality. It is not easy to transform ordinary experience into flow, but almost everyone can improve his or her ability to do so. While the remainder of this book will continue to explore the phenomenon of optimal experience, which in turn should help the reader to become more familiar with it, we shall now consider another issue, whether all people have the same potential to control consciousness, and if not, what distinguishes those who do it easily from those who don't. Some individuals might be constitutionally incapable of experiencing flow. Psychiatrists describe schizophrenics as suffering from an anhedonia, anhedonia, which literally means lack of pleasure. This symptom appears to be related to stimulus over inclusion, which refers to the fact that schizophrenics are condemned to notice irrelevant stimuli, to process information whether they like it or not. The schizophrenic's tragic inability to keep things in or out of consciousness is vividly described by some patients. Things just happen to me now, and I have no control over them. I don't seem to have the same say in things anymore. At times, I can't even control what I think about, or things are coming in too fast. I lose my grip of it and get lost. I am attending to everything at once, and as a result, I do not really attend to anything. And there's a footnote about that. Let's see here. Stimulus over inclusion in schizophrenia. The concept of anhedonia was originally developed by the psychiatrist Roy Grinker. Over-inclusion and the symptomatology of attentional disorders have been studied by, among others, Harrow, Grinker, Holtzman, and Caton, 1977, and Harrow, Tucker, Hanover, and Shield, 1972. The quotations are from McGee and Chapman, 1961, page 109 and 114. I have argued the continuity between lack of flow experiences due to severe psychopathologies and milder attentional disorders, often caused by social deprivation in Mr. C, 1978, 1982a. Unable to concentrate, attending indiscriminately to everything, patients who suffer from this disease, not surprisingly, end up unable to enjoy themselves. But what causes stimulus over inclusion in the first place? Part of the answer probably has to do with innate genetic causes. Some people are just temperamentally less able to concentrate their psychic energy than others. Among school children, a great variety of learning disabilities have often have been reclassified under the heading of attentional disorders because what they have in common is lack of control over attention. To depend on chemical imbalances, it is also very likely that the quality of childhood experience will either exacerbate or alleviate their course. From our point of view, it is important to realize is that attentional disorders not only interfere with learning, but effectively rule out the possibility of experiencing flow as well. When a person cannot control psychic energy, neither learning nor true enjoyment is possible. I'm sorry, but his use of psychic energy kind of throws me off a little bit. I think he uses that interchangeably with consciousness, right? Um, he probably did define it, psychic energy and consciousness. I don't know. It's just not very, feels very muddy. Doesn't feel very clear. I mean, that just, that thought just hit me. Sorry, a little squirrel there. A less drastic obstacle is experiencing flow. To experiencing flow is excessive self-consciousness. A person who is constantly worried about how others will perceive her, who, interesting, he uses her, not him. Hmm. Who is a hmm. Who is afraid of creating the wrong impression? I got another another thought. Uh, kind of a very very subtle, but it's sort of like a derogatory kind of way. The use of her. I don't know. I could be wrong. It's just my impression. It's very, very subtle, but that's the feeling I get. Anyways, let's do that again. Got a little squirrel there. A person who is constantly worried about how others will perceive her, who is afraid of creating the wrong impression, or of doing something inappropriate is also condemned to permanent exclusion from enjoyment. So are people who are excessively self-centered. A self-centered individual is usually not self-conscious, but instead evaluates every bit of information only in terms of how it relates to her desires. For such a person, everything is valueless in itself. A flower is not worth a second look unless it can be used. A man or woman who cannot advance one's interests does not deserve further attention. Consciousness is structured entirely in terms of its own ends. Nothing is allowed to exist in it that does not conform to those ends. Although a self-conscious person is in many respects different from a self-centered one, neither is in enough control of psychic energy to enter easily into a flow experience. Both lack the attentional fluidity needed to relate to activities for their own sake. Too much psychic energy is wrapped up in the self, and free attention is rigidly guided by its needs. Under these conditions, it is difficult to become interested in intrinsic goals, to lose oneself in an activity that offers no rewards outside the interaction itself. Attentional disorders and stimulus over inclusion prevent flow because psychic energy is too fluid and erratic. Excessive self-consciousness and self-centeredness prevent it for the opposite reason. Attention is too rigid and tight. Neither extreme allows a person to control attention. Those who operate at these extremes cannot enjoy themselves, have a difficult time learning, and forfeit opportunities for the growth of the self. Paradoxically, a self-centered self cannot become more complex because all the psychic energy at its disposal is invested in fulfilling its current goals instead of learning about new ones. The impediments to flow considered thus far are located within the individual himself. Well, here he uses himself, interesting. But there are also many powerful environmental obstacles to enjoyment. Some of these are natural, some social in origin. For instance, I wonder if he another squirrel. I wonder if he's deliberate in terms of using the pronouns, like when he uses himself and when he uses herself. I don't know. It's just a question that came to mind. Some of these are natural and some social in origin. For example, or for instance, one would expect that people living in the incredibly harsh conditions of the Arctic regions or in the Kalahari Desert would have little opportunity to enjoy their lives. Yet, even the most severe natural conditions cannot entirely eliminate flow. The Eskimos, in their bleak, inhospitable lands, learn to sing, dance, joke, carve beautiful objects, and create an elaborate mythology to give order and sense to their experiences. Possibly the snow dwellers and the sand dwellers who cannot build enjoyment into their lives eventually gave up and died out. But the fact that some survived shows that nature alone cannot prevent flow from happening. And I noticed in the footnote, there are several of the highlighted words. So I'm just going to read it all and then read the footnote all at the same time. The social conditions that inhibit flow might be more difficult to overcome. One of the consequences of slavery, oppression, exploitation, and the destruction of cultural values is the elimination of enjoyment. When the now extinct natives of the Caribbean islands were put to work in the plantations of the conquering Spaniards, their lives became so painful and meaningless that they lost interest in survival and eventually ceased reproducing. It is probable that many cultures disappeared in a similar fashion because they were no longer able to provide the experience of enjoyment. Okay. Just checking something there. Two terms describing states of social pathology apply also to conditions that make flow difficult to experience: anomie and alienation. Anomie, literally lack of rules, is the name the French sociologist Emile Durkheim gave to a condition in society in which the norms of behavior have become muddled. When it is no longer clear what is permitted and what is not, when it is uncertain what public opinion values, behavior becomes erratic and meaningless. Well, becomes erratic and meaningless if they don't have God in their lives. I wanted to add. That's just my opinion. People who depend on the rules of society to give order to their consciousness become anxious. Anomic situations might arise when the economy collapses or when one culture is destroyed by another, but they can also come about when prosperity increases rapidly and old values of thrift and hard work are no longer as relevant as they had been. It is Oh, okay. It is interesting to note that these two societal obstacles to flow, anomie and alienation, are functionally equivalent to the two personal pathologies, attentional disorders and self-centeredness. At both levels, the individual and the collective, what prevents flow from occurring is either the fragmentation of attentional processes, as in anomie and attentional disorders, or their excessive rigidity, as in alienation and self-centeredness. At the individual level, anomie corresponds to anxiety, while alienation corresponds to boredom. Okay, let's read what the footnote has to say. And I'll read the next paragraph as well, the footnote for next paragraph. So we don't have to go back and forth. I hope that's not too confusing. Okay, among the studies of the Eskimo that are worth reading are those of Carpenter, 1970, 1973. The destruction of Caribbean cultures is described by Mintz, 1985. The concept of anomie was originally developed by Emily Durkheim in his work Suicide, 1897, 1951. The best introduction to the concept of alienation is in the early manuscripts of Karl Marx. especially his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, C. Tucker, 1972. The sociologist Richard Mitchell, 1983-1988, has argued that anomie and alienation are the societal counterparts of anxiety and boredom, respectively, and that they occur when people cannot find flow because the conditions of everyday life are either too chaotic or too unpredictable. The neurophysiological hypothesis concerning attention and flow is based on the following research. Hamilton, 1976-1981, Hamilton, Holcomb, and De La Pena, 1977, and Hamilton, Heyer, and Buxbaum, 1984. This line of research is now continuing with the use of more sophisticated brain scanning equipment. Neurophysiology and flow. Just as some people are born with better muscular coordination, it is possible that there are individuals with a genetic advantage in controlling consciousness. Such people might be less prone to suffer from attentional disorders, and they may experience flow more easily. Dr. Jean Hamilton's, or Jean, I guess it's French. Oh, her. Okay, so it's a woman. So it's Jean. Dr. Jean Hamilton's research with visual perception and cortical activation patterns lends support to such a claim. One set of her evidence is based on a test in which subjects had to look at an ambiguous figure, a Necker cube, or an Esker-type illustration that at one point seems to be coming out of the plane of the paper toward the viewer, and the next moment seems to recede behind the plane, and then perpetually reverse it, that is, see the figure that just out of the surface as if it were sinking back and vice versa. Dr. Hamilton found that students who respond less intrinsic motivation in daily life needed on the average to fix their eyes on more points before they could reverse the ambiguous figure. Whereas students who, on the whole, found their lives more intrinsically rewarding needed to look at fewer points or even only a single point to reverse the same figure. These findings suggest that people might vary in the number of external cues they need to accomplish the same mental task. Individuals who require a great deal of outside information to form representations of reality in consciousness may become more dependent on the external environment for using their minds. They would have less control over their thoughts, which in turn would make it more difficult for them to enjoy experience. By contrast, people who need only a few external cues to represent events in consciousness are more autonomous from the environment. They have a more flexible attention that allows them to restructure experience more easily and therefore to achieve optimal experiences more frequently. In another set of experiments, students who did and who did not report frequent flow experiences were asked to pay attention to flashes of lights or to tones in a laboratory. When the subjects were involved in this attentional task, their cortical activation in response to the stimuli was measured and averaged separately for the visual and the auditory conditions. These are called evoked potentials. You know, psychiatrists and psychologists, just a side note here, and quote unquote doctors in general, they sure do come up with like fancy words and phrases. Probably these fancy words and phrases could probably uh, be how do you say it? Explained in very simple terms, but they make it complicated. Dr. Hamilton's findings showed that subjects who reported only rarely experiencing flow behaved as expected. When responding to the flashing stimuli, their activation went up significantly above their baseline level. But the results from subjects who reported flow frequently were very surprising. Activation decreased when they were concentrating. Instead of requiring more effort, investment of attention actually seemed to decrease mental effort. A separate behavioral measure of attention confirmed that this group was also more accurate in a sustained attentional task. Allergies acting up a bit here. Let's see here. Okay, cortical activation. Cortical activation is the amount of electrical activity in the cerebral cortex at a given moment in time. Its amplitude in microvolts has been used to indicate the general effort taking place in the brain at the time. When people concentrate their attention, their cortical activation is generally found to increase, indicating an increase in mental effort. The most likely explanation for this unusual finding seems to be that the group reporting more flow was able to reduce mental activity in every information channel, but the one involved in concentrating on the flashing stimuli. This in turn suggests that people who can enjoy themselves in a variety of situations have the ability to screen out stimulation and to focus only on what they decide is relevant for the moment. While paying attention ordinarily involves an additional burden of information processing above the usual baseline effort, for people who have learned to control consciousness, focusing attention is relatively effortless because they can shut off all mental processes but the relevant ones. It is this flexibility of attention which contrasts so sharply with the helpless over-inclusion of the schizophrenic that may provide the neurological basis for the autotatic personality. The neurological evidence does not, however, prove that some individuals have inherited a genetic advantage in controlling attention and therefore experiencing flow. The findings could be explained in terms of learning rather than inheritance. The association between the ability to concentrate and flow is clear. It will take further research to ascertain which one causes the other. The effects of the family on the autotatic personality. A neurological advantage in processing information may not be the only key to explaining why some people have a good time waiting at a bus station while others are bored, no matter how entertaining their environment is. Early childhood influences are also very likely factors in determining whether a person will or will not easily experience flow. There is ample evidence to suggest that how parents interact with a child will have a lasting effect on the kind of person that child grows up to be. In one of our studies conducted at the University of Chicago, for example, Kevin Roth, Rath, Rath, what? Rathun, Rathun, Rathundi? Sorry, butchered that name. I'll just say Kevin. Kevin R. observed that teenagers who had certain types of relationship with their parents were significantly more happy, satisfied, and strong in most life situations than their peers who did not have such a relationship. The family context promoting optimal experience could be described as having 5 characteristics. The first one is clarity. The teenagers feel that they know what their parents expect from them. Goals and feedback in the family interaction are ambiguous. The second is centering, or the children's perception that the parents are interested in what they are doing in the present, in their concrete feelings and experiences, rather than being preoccupied with whether they will be getting into a good college or obtaining a well-paying job. Next is the issue of choice. Children feel that they have a variety of possibility. Children feel that they have a variety of possibilities from which to choose, including that of breaking parental rules, as long as they're prepared to face the consequences. The fourth differentiating characteristic is commitment, or the trust that allows the child to feel comfortable enough to set aside the shield of his defenses and become unself-consciously involved in whatever he is interested in. Whatever he is interested in, huh? Not she, huh? That is interesting. And finally, there is a challenge, or the parents' dedication to provide increasingly complex opportunities for action to their children. I just had a thought. I wonder, I don't know if this would be a sexist statement. I wonder if he uses the pronoun he for situations that help boost the ego or put the male, you know, the man or the guy or the boy or whatever in a better light, like in a good light, but uses the pronoun she or her when there is a little, you know, I don't know what the word is, little derogatory or lack of self-confidence or, situations like that. I don't know. That was a thought that just came to mind. Hmm. The presence of these five conditions made possible what was called the autotetic family context because they provide an ideal training for enjoying life. The five characteristics clearly parallel the dimensions of the flow experience. Children who grow up in family situations that facilitate clarity of goals, feedback, feeling of control, concentration on the task at hand, intrinsic motivation, and challenge will generally have a better chance to order their lives so as to make flow possible. Okay, let's see here. The study of autotetic families is reported in, okay, that's the Kevin R. guy. In 1988, his findings are in line with many previous investigations. For instance, that securely attached infants engage more in exploratory behavior. Ainsworth, Bell, and Straighten, 1971. Matas, Arend, and Schrofe, sorry, butchered that name, 1978, or that an optimal balance between love and discipline is the best child rearing context. Bronfenbrenner, 1970, Devereux, 1970, Baumrein, 1977. The systems approach to family studies, which is very congenial with the one developed here, was pioneered in clinical settings by Bowen, 1978. Moreover, families that provide an autotetic context conserve a great deal of psychic energy for their individual members, thus making it possible to increase enjoyment all around. Children who know what they can and cannot do, who do not have to constantly argue about rules and controls, who are not worried about their parents' expectations for future success always hanging over their heads, are released from many of the attentional demands that more chaotic households generate. They are free to develop interests in activities that will expand their selves. In less well-developed families, a great deal of energy is expanded in constant negotiations and strife, and in the children's attempts to protect their fragile selves from being overwhelmed by other people's goals. I think he's saying this as a generalization. I don't think that this happens in every situation, because there are families that are not doing well economically, or I don't know. I have to think about that. It sounds like a generalization. I don't think it's environment has to do with it, but I think it's also the way. So, like a family who's poor, who's economically not successful and things like that, they could have a very positive environment. The mom can be very supportive of the kid. And then, you can have healthy families, or not healthy, but successful and rich families whose kids are miserable psychologically, because the parents put a lot of pressure on them. I don't know. That's something I have to think about. Anyways, that's just a feeling, that just a thought that came to me as I was reading that paragraph. It just seems very generalized. That's all. Okay. All right, Christina. No more No more squirrels. Where am I? See, I lost my place already. I think I finished. Okay, here we go. Not surprisingly, the differences between teenagers whose families provided an autotetic context and those whose families, see, he uses that big word, autotetic. I still don't, well, I'm forgetful. He probably did define it, but I don't remember what he said now. Anyways, autotetic context and those whose families did not were strongest when the children were at home with the family. Here, those from an autotetic context were much more happy, strong, cheerful, and satisfied than their less fortunate peers. But the differences were also present when the teenagers were alone studying or in school. Here, too, optimal experience was more accessible to children from autotetic families. Only when teenagers were with their friends did the differences disappear. With friends, both groups felt equally positive, regardless of whether the families were autotetic or not. It is likely that there are ways that parents behave with babies much earlier in life that will also predispose them to find enjoyment, either with ease or with difficulty. On this issue, however, there are no long-term studies that trace the cause and effect relationships over time. It stands to reason, however, that a child who has been abused or who has often been threatened with the withdrawal of parental love, and unfortunately, we are becoming increasingly aware of what a disturbing proportion of children in our culture are so mistreated, will be so uh, will be so worried about keeping his sense of self from coming apart as to have little energy left to pursue intrinsic rewards. Instead of seeking the complexity of enjoyment, an ill-treated child is likely to grow up into an adult who will be satisfied to obtain as much pleasure as possible from life. The people of flow. The traits that mark an autotetic personality are most clearly revealed by people who seem to enjoy situations that ordinary persons would find unbearable. Lost in Antarctica or confined to a prison cell, some individuals succeed in transforming their harrowing conditions into a manageable and even enjoyable struggle, whereas most others would succumb to the ordeal. Richard Logan, who has studied the accounts of many people in difficult situations, concludes that they survive by finding ways to turn their bleak objective conditions into subjectively controllable experience. They followed the blueprint of flow activities. First, they paid close attention to the most minute details of their environment, discovering in it hidden opportunities for action that matched what little they were capable of doing given the circumstances. Then they set goals appropriate to their precarious situation and closely monitored progress through the feedback they received. Whenever they reached their goal, they upped the ante, setting increasingly complex challenges for themselves. Christopher Burney, a prisoner of the Nazis who had spent a long time in solitary confinement during World War II, gives a fairly typical example of this process. If the reach of experience is suddenly confined, and we are left with only a little food for thought or feeling, we are apt to take the few objects that offer themselves and ask a whole catalog of often absurd questions about them. Does it work? How? Who made it? And of what? And in parallel, when and where did I last see something like it? And what else does it remind me of? So we set in train a wonderful flow of combinations and associations in our minds, the length and complexity of which soon obscures its humble starting point. My bed, for example, could be measured and roughly classified with school beds or army beds. When I had done with the bed, which was too simple to intrigue me long, I felt the blankets, estimated the warmth, examined the precise mechanics of the window, the discomfort of the toilet, computed the length and breadth, the orientation and elevation of the cell, italics added. Okay, let me read the rest of the paragraph, and then I'll read all the highlighted footnotes at the same time. Essentially, the same ingenuity in finding opportunities for mental action and setting goals is reported by survivors of any solitary confinement, from diplomats captured by terrorists to elderly ladies imprisoned by Chinese communists. Ava Zazel, a ceramic designer who was imprisoned in Moscow's Lubyanka prison for over a year by Stalin's police, kept her sanity by figuring out how she would make a bra out of materials at hand, playing chess against herself in her head, holding imaginary conversations in French, doing gymnastics, and memorizing the poems she composed. Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes how one of his fellow prisoners in the Lefortovo jail mapped the world on the floor of the cell and then imagined himself traveling across Asia and Europe to America, covering a few kilometers each day. The same game was independently discovered by many prisoners. For instance, Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, sustained himself in Spandau prison for months by pretending he was taking a walking trip from Berlin to Jerusalem, in which his imagination provided all the events and sights along the way. Okay. Um, okay, the people of flow. This is the term Richard Logan, 1985, 1988, used to describe individuals who are able to transform trying ordeals into flow experiences. The quote, if the reach of experience, is from Burney, 1952, page 16 to 18. And Ava Zaysel's imprisonment is described in a New Yorker profile, Lessard, 1987. How a Chinese lady survived the brutalities of the Cultural Revolution is the subject of Life and Death in Shanghai, Cheng, 1987. Solzhenitsyn's accounts of prison are from the Gulag Archipelago, 1976. Okay, my allergies acting up today. I guess spring is here. Okay, an acquaintance who worked in the United States Air Force intelligence tells the story of a pilot who was imprisoned in North Vietnam for many years and lost 80 pounds and much of his health in a jungle camp. When he was released, one of the first things he asked for was to play a game of golf. To the great astonishment of his fellow officers, he played a superb game, despite his emaciated condition. To their inquiries, he replied that every day of his imprisonment, he imagined himself playing 18 holes, carefully choosing his clubs and approach and systematically varying the course. This discipline not only helped preserve his sanity, but apparently also kept his physical skills well honed. Tolles Tibor, a poet who spent several years in solitary confinement during the most repressive phases of the Hungarian communist regime, says that in the Visegrad jail, where hundreds of intellectuals were imprisoned, the inmates kept themselves occupied for more than a year by devising a poetry translation contest. First, they had to decide on the poem to translate. It took months to pass the nominations around from cell to cell, and several more months of ingenious secret messages before the votes were tallied. Finally, it was agreed that Walt Whitman's "O Captain, My Captain" was to be the poem to translate into Hungarian because partly it was the one that most of the prisoners could recall from memory in the original English. Now began the serious work. Everyone sat down to make his own version of the poem. Since no paper or writing tool was available, Tolles spread a film of soap on the soles of his shoes and carved the letters into it with a toothpick. When a line was learned by heart, he covered his shoe with a new coating of soap. As the various stanzas were written, they were memorized by the translator and passed on to the next cell. After a while, a dozen versions of the poem were circulating in the jail, and each was evaluated and voted on by all the inmates. After the Whitman translation was adjudicated, the prisoners went on to tackle a poem by Schiller. Okay. Now, the account of Tola's Tibor is reconstructed from personal conversations we had in the summer of 1957 when he was released from jail after the Hungarian Revolution. I think I missed a few highlighters because here I have Solzhenitsyn, Bettelheim, Franco, and Russell. But I only have Russell highlighted. Okay. All right. So I think what I'll do is finish the chapter and then read the footnote. And then we'll call it a day. How's that? Okay. When adversity threatens to paralyze us, we need to reassert control by finding a new direction in which to invest psychic energy, a direction that lies outside the reach of external forces. When every aspiration is frustrated, a person still must seek a meaningful goal around which to organize the self. Then, even though the person is objectively a slave, subjectively he is free. So slavery is in the mind, isn't it? Interesting, huh? Uh, Abraham Hicks used to say that you're so free that you can imprison yourself. You could choose to imprison yourself in your mind, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Solzhenitsyn describes very well how even the most degrading situation can be transformed into a flow experience. Sometimes, when standing in a column of dejected prisoners, amidst the shouts of guards with machine guns, I felt such a rush of rhymes and images that I seemed to be wafted overhead. At such moments, I was both free and happy. Some prisoners tried to escape by smashing through the barbed wire. For me, there was no barbed wire. The head count of prisoners remained unchanged, but I was actually away on a distant flight. Not only prisoners report these strategies for wresting control back to their own consciousness, explorers like Admiral Byrd, who once spent 4 cold, dark months by himself in a tiny hut near the South Pole, or Charles Lindbergh facing hostile elements alone on his transatlantic flight, resorted to the same steps to keep the integrity of their selves. But what makes some people able to achieve this internal control, while most others are swept away by external hardships? Richard Logan proposes an answer based on the writings of many survivors, including those of Viktor Frankl and Bruno Bettelheim, who have reflected on the sources of strength under extreme adversity. He concludes that the most important trait of survivors is a non-self-conscious individualism, or a strongly directed purpose that is not self-seeking. People who have that quality are bent on doing their best in all circumstances, yet they are not concerned primarily with advancing their own interests. Because they are intrinsically motivated in their actions, they are not easily disturbed by external threats. With enough psychic energy free to observe and analyze their surroundings objectively, they have a better chance of discovering in them new opportunities for action. If we were to consider one trait a key element of the autotetic personality, this might be it. Narcissistic individuals who are mainly concerned with protecting their self fall apart when the external conditions turn threatening. The ensuing panic prevents them from doing what they must do. Their attention turns inward in an effort to restore order in consciousness, and not enough remains to negotiate outside reality. Without interest in the world, a desire to be actively related to it, a person becomes isolated into himself. Bertrand Russell, one of the greatest philosophers of our century, described how he achieved personal happiness. Gradually, I learned to be indifferent to myself and my deficiencies. I came to center my attention increasingly upon external objects, the state of the world, various branches of knowledge, individuals for whom I felt affection. There could be no better short description of how to build for oneself an autocratic personality. It is said that you have all the answers within yourself. I believe that's a true statement in a way. No, not in a way. I believe that. I think that's pretty true. The more I think about it, yeah, it's incredible. We have all the answers within ourselves. In part, such a personality is a gift of biological inheritance and early upbringing. Some people are born with a more focused and flexible neurological endowment, or are fortunate to have had parents who promoted unself-conscious individuality. But it is an ability open to cultivation, a skill one can perfect through training and discipline. It is now time to explore further the ways this can be done. Okay, now the quote from Solzhenitsyn is cited in Logan, 1985. Bettelheim presents his generalizations about imprisonment based on his concentration camp experiences in the article Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, 1943. For Franco, see Man's Search for Meaning and The Unheard Cry for Meaning, 1963-1978. And the quotation from Russell was cited in an article in Self magazine, Mercer, 1987, page 147. And that's the end of chapter 4. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. And we will continue our reading next week. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and a great week, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye now.